My name is Julian Reyes, and 3 days ago, I stood in a hospital corridor and signed a piece of paper that took my family's power away from them forever. Told they didn't know I'd already signed it. My Uncle Frank stood 10 feet away, telling a nurse that the family had made its decision. My Aunt Carol nodded along, dabbing dry eyes with a tissue she never actually needed. They thought they were in charge of what happened to my grandfather. They weren't. They hadn't been for 14 months. My name is Julian Reyes, and 3 days ago, I stood in a hospital corridor and signed a piece of paper that took my family's power away from them forever. Told they didn't know I'd already signed it. My Uncle Frank stood 10 feet away, telling a nurse that the family had made its decision. My Aunt Carol nodded along, dabbing dry eyes with a tissue she never actually needed. They thought they were in charge of what happened to my grandfather. They weren't. They hadn't been for 14 months. Now let me take you back 6 years, to a kitchen that smelled like cedar and coffee, when my grandfather told me something I didn't understand until the night the machines started beeping the way they're not supposed to beep. My grandfather's house sat at the end of a gravel road, and even now I can tell you exactly what it smelled like: cedar shavings from his workshop, old coffee that sat too long on the stove, and in autumn, wood smoke drifting in from the chimney before he'd even lit a fire, just sitting in the walls from years of it. I was 11 the first time he let me hold a chisel. His hands were rough, the kind of rough that comes from 40 years of carpentry, and he wrapped them around mine to guide the blade. Wood doesn't lie to you, he said. People do. Wood just tells you what it is. I didn't understand that sentence for a long time. And I remember the texture of his flannel jacket when he'd pull me in for a hug, rough wool, smelling faintly of pipe tobacco he'd quit years before but that never quite left the fabric. Sunday dinners were different. Sunday dinners were at the big house, where my Uncle Frank and Aunt Carol lived with my grandfather after my grandmother passed. The table was glass and chrome. The food was catered more often than cooked. And the conversation, even when I was young, circled money the way vultures circle something dying. I remember being 12, sitting under that glass table doing homework, and hearing Frank say to Carol, "Lo, he's not going to live forever. Someone needs to talk to him about the house before he does something stupid with it." I didn't know what "something stupid" meant. I only knew the word stupid was doing a lot of work in that sentence, and none of it was kind. My grandfather never spoke about Frank and Carol with anger. He just got quieter around them. He'd retreat to his workshop, and I'd find him sanding the same piece of wood longer than it needed, like his hands needed something honest to do. I remember one dinner in particular, when I was 13. Carol had brought home a brochure for a retirement community 2 states away, glossy and bright, and set it casually by my grandfather's plate like it was a menu. Just something to think. Had brought home a brochure for a retirement community 2 states away, glossy and bright, and set it casually by my grandfather's plate like it was a menu. Just something to think about, Dad, she said. The house is a lot for you to keep up. My grandfather didn't answer. He picked up his fork and kept eating, but later that night I found the brochure in the kitchen trash, folded into a small, deliberate square, as if he wanted it to take up as little space in the world as possible. One evening, walking me back from the workshop to the big house for dinner, he stopped on the gravel and said, "Julian, the people who love you tell you the truth even when it costs them something. The people who want something from you tell you what you want to hear." He looked at the lit windows of the house ahead of us. Learn to tell the difference. It'll save your life one day. I was 11. I thought he meant making friends at school. I had no idea yet how literally true that sentence would become, or how much it would matter. 14 years later, in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic instead of cedar, the stroke happened on a Tuesday in March, 2 years ago. My grandfather was 78. He survived it, but it took the left side of his body and most of his speech, leaving him in a wheelchair in a converted downstairs room at the big house, a feeding tube taped to his cheek for the worst of it. I drove 4 hours every other weekend to sit with him. Frank and Carol called it managing his care. That's the word they used for everything that used to be love: managing. Managing his medication. Managing his visitors. Managing, eventually, his money. I watched Frank's face the day the doctor first used the word prognosis. There was no grief in it. There was arithmetic. 6 months after the stroke, I came down for a weekend visit and arrived a day early. The house was quiet, and I let myself in through the side door, the one that doesn't creak, old habit from childhood. I heard Frank's voice from the study before I saw him. He was on the phone. No, I'm telling you, once the conservatorship goes through, we don't need anyone's sign-off. The house, the workshop land, the account, all of it moves under the estate plan we file. He won't even understand what he's agreeing to. A pause. Then, quieter, almost cheerful, he's not. Under the estate plan we file. He won't even understand what he's agreeing to. A pause. Then, quieter, almost cheerful, he's not going to be around long enough to fight it anyway. I stood in the hallway and didn't move. I didn't gasp. I didn't walk in and demand answers. I just listened, memorizing the shape of what I'd heard, the way my grandfather had once taught me to memorize the grain of a piece of wood before I cut it. I said nothing that weekend. I sat with my grandfather, held the hand that still worked, and read to him from the newspaper because his eyes tired easily. He couldn't say much. But he squeezed my hand twice when I read him the baseball scores, the same way he used to squeeze it on Saturday mornings. I started visiting more. Not to confront anyone, to watch. I noticed Frank had started referring to the workshop as the asset. I noticed Carol had stopped calling my grandfather Dad in front of the lawyer who visited once a month, and started calling him the client. I was 25 years old, broke from law school debt, working a research job at a firm that didn't pay enough. I had no money, no standing, no legal power. In every room that mattered, I was invisible, the grandson who showed up on weekends and didn't say much. It took me a long time to understand that. Invisibility was the only thing I had. Frank and Carol had stopped paying attention to me precisely because I never gave them a reason to. So I decided, quietly, in that hallway, that I would keep giving them no reason. I would become so unremarkable that no one would think to watch what I was doing. I started doing small things, things that meant nothing on their own. I kept a notebook in my car, and after every visit, I wrote down the date and whatever I'd. Lawyer's name, a sentence about the asset. I photographed paperwork I found left out on the kitchen counter, careful to put it back exactly where it had been. I never took anything. I never asked a single suspicious question. I just watched, the way my grandfather had taught me to watch the grain of a piece of wood before deciding where to cut. I also started spending more time in the workshop itself, even though my grandfather couldn't join me out there anymore. I kept it clean. I oiled the tools so they wouldn't rust. I told myself it was for him, in case he ever came back out to it, but some part of me understood I was also protecting the one place in that family that had never once been about money. I didn't know yet what I was going to do. I only knew I wasn't going to do nothing. It was a Tuesday, almost a year after the stroke, when my grandfather pressed something into my hand during a visit. His right hand still worked enough for small, deliberate movements. It was a small brass key, old, the kind that doesn't match anything in a modern house. He pointed, with effort, toward the workshop window. Then he pointed at me. Then he made a motion like turning a key in a lock. I waited 3 days before I went out there alone. The workshop still smelled like cedar, even with the equipment dusty and unused. Behind a false panel in the workbench, the same workbench where he'd taught me to hold a chisel, I found a metal box. Inside it was a folder, and on top of the folder, in his handwriting, slow and shaky but unmistakably his, for Julian. Call Marisalchin first. Marisalchin turned out to be an estate attorney in the city, a woman in her 50s with steady eyes and a calm, clipped way of talking that I would come to trust completely. Your grandfather came to me 3 years ago, she told me, the first time we spoke, after he overheard your uncle discussing the house with a real estate agent without his knowledge. He didn't trust what he was hearing in his own home. So he restructured everything. Quietly. What I learned over the next 2 meetings rearranged everything I thought I understood about my own family. My grandfather had placed the workshop land, the house, and the bulk of his savings into an irrevocable trust years before his stroke, one that named me as successor trustee, not Frank, not Carol. He'd also executed a durable power of attorney and an advance healthcare directive that named me, specifically, as his medical decision-maker, replacing an older document that had named Frank. Frank didn't know the replacement existed. Neither did Carol. He came to me on a Thursday afternoon, alone. No one else in the family knew, Marisol told me. He said he'd overheard something the week before that he couldn't unhear. He didn't raise his voice about it. He just asked me what his options were, and then he quietly exercised every one of them. The conservatorship Frank was quietly pursuing, the one I'd overheard him planning in the hallway, would have given him control only if no valid directive already existed. One already did. It had existed for 3 years. Frank's entire plan had been built on a document that no longer had any legal weight. He protected you, Marisol said, a long time before he needed you to know it. I sat with that for a long moment. Let it breathe. My grandfather, half paralyzed, unable to say more than a few words at a time, had still found a way to outthink 2 people who thought he was already gone. Marisol also showed me something I hadn't expected, a short letter, typed and signed before the stroke, addressed to me. It didn't explain the trust or the directive. It only said that he trusted me to use what he'd built the way wood is used, honestly. And for something that lasts. I read it twice in her office and didn't say anything for a while. 3 weeks later, I overheard Frank on the phone again, this time with a different lawyer, finalizing a court filing date, March 14th, a Thursday, asking for a $40,000 retainer to be paid from what he called the estate account. He had no idea that account required my signature now, as trustee, for anything over $500. That night, I texted Marisol 2 words, I'm ready. I watched Frank and Carol go to bed that night discussing seating arrangements for a hearing that would never go the way they expected. They slept soundly. I didn't sleep at all, not from fear. From the strange, quiet weight of finally knowing exactly what I was carrying. Marisol walked me through it in plain language, sitting across from me at her office with my grandfather's documents spread between us like a map. Your grandfather's directive supersedes Frank's old one automatically. There's nothing to fight there, she said. The trust means Frank's conservatorship petition is asking a judge for control over assets that already left probate years ago. He's suing for something that isn't there to take. All we have to do is show up with the documents and let the court see what already exists. My job, she explained, was simple and almost anticlimactic: be present at the hearing, bring the original notarized documents, and answer the judge's questions honestly. The system would do the rest. Have you ever had to stay silent to protect yourself, even when every part of you wanted to speak up? Tell me in the comments. I read them. A week before the hearing, Frank invited me to lunch, the first time in years he'd asked for my company without my grandfather present. He ordered for both of us without asking. Over coffee, he slid a folded check across the table. Once this conservatorship clears, there's going to be a family allowance set up. I want to make sure you're taken care of, Julian. You've always been good to your grandfather. Loyalty like that should be rewarded. I looked at the check. I looked at him. I'll think about it, I said. He smiled like he'd already won. I let him believe that. My son, Mateo, was 6 that spring, and even he noticed something had changed in our house. He found me sitting alone on the back porch one evening, the documents in a folder beside me, and he climbed into my lap. Without asking why. You look like Grandpa Walter, he said, when he's thinking real hard before he does something important. I laughed, a real laugh, the first one in weeks. I hadn't realized how closely he'd been watching either of us. The night before the hearing, I drove out to my grandfather's workshop alone. I sat on the old stool by the workbench, in air that still smelled faintly of cedar under all the dust, and for a moment I wanted nothing more than to drive to the big house and tell Frank and Carol exactly what I knew, just to see their faces change in real time. I remembered what my grandfather told me on that gravel road when I was 11. The people who love you tell you the truth even when it costs them. The people who want something from you tell you what you want to hear. Frank had just tried to buy my silence with a check. My grandfather had spent 3 years protecting me with paperwork I didn't even know existed. I cried then, not from weakness, but from finally understanding what real love had looked like all along, quiet and procedural and unglamorous, sitting in a metal box behind a false panel. I sat there long enough that the light through the workshop window turned from gold to gray, and I let myself feel all of it before I drove home. I wish this were different. I wish Frank had been the kind of son who would have sat by that hospital bed instead of calculating what grandfather how he felt, even once, instead of asking the lawyer what the timeline looked like. But wishes don't hold up in court. Trusts do, and if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, because this story is about to turn. It was 11:50 p.m. the night before the hearing when Marisol called to confirm the final details. I sat alone at the kitchen table, my son asleep upstairs, my wife already in bed, the house silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. Everything's in order, Marisol said. Original directive, original trust documents, the certified copies for the court. Tomorrow, you just tell the truth and let the paper speak for itself. I signed the last authorization she needed electronically, the cursor blinking on the laptop screen in an otherwise dark kitchen. My hand was steady. I'd expected it to shake. Your grandfather did something most people never manage, Marisol said before we hung up. He made sure that even after he couldn't speak for himself anymore, the truth would still get said. You're just the one saying it now. I looked at the clock. 12:03 a.m. I am 26 years old. I am the trustee of my grandfather's estate, and as of that signature, the only person with legal authority over his medical care. Across town, I knew, Frank was almost certainly still awake too, reviewing his talking points for a hearing he believed he was about to win. He had no idea the conservatorship he was about to ask for was already legally impossible. He'd spent 3 weeks preparing arguments for a case that had been decided 3 years before he ever filed it. He'd find that out in about 9 hours. The hearing was set for 9 a.m., but Frank cornered me in the courthouse hallway at 8:45, his voice low and urgent. Julian, listen, whatever Marisol's told you, this is more complicated than you understand. Just let the adults handle this. I know what's best for him. I looked at him, calm, unhurried. I think I understand it pretty well, actually, I said. We'll see in there. He looked at me like I was still the nephew who nodded along at Sunday dinners. I wasn't. I hadn't been for 14 months. Inside, it took less than 20 minutes. Marisol presented the original advance directive and the trust documents. The judge reviewed them, asked me 2 direct questions, which I answered plainly, and then looked at Frank's attorney. Counsel, your client's petition presupposes that no valid healthcare directive or trust currently exists. The court has just reviewed documents showing both have existed, and been properly executed, for over 3 years. I'm dismissing this petition. There was a brief exchange after that, Frank's attorney asking for time to review, the judge declining. The whole thing wrapped up faster than the time it had taken us to find parking outside the courthouse. Frank's face didn't move for a full 5 seconds. Then it just went still, the particular stillness of a man recalculating everything he thought he knew. Carol stared at the table. Neither of them said a word to me as we left the courtroom. My phone rang an hour later. It was Carol, asking, in a voice gone suddenly small, if she could still come visit my grandfather on Sundays. That's between you and him, I said. I'm not going to be the one who decides who gets to love him. I just decide who gets to lie to him. And that part's over. My grandfather used to say that Wood doesn't lie to you, only people do, and that learning to tell the difference would save my life one day. I used to think he meant making good friends, picking the right people to trust at school, small things. He meant something much bigger. He meant that someday I would have to sit in a room full of people who loved the idea of him more than the man himself, and I would need to already know, in my bones, who was telling me the truth and who was just telling me what I wanted to hear. Frank still calls sometimes, polite now, careful, the confidence gone out of his voice. He visits my grandfather every few weeks, and as far as I can tell, it might even be genuine now that there's nothing left to gain from it. Carol comes on Sundays, like she asked. Marisol still manages the trust paperwork, and still calls me, every few months, just to check in on Walter. She always asks about him by name, never the client. As for me, I still have the workshop. It's mine now, under the trust, though I think of it as his. The cedar smell never quite leaves the walls. My son Mateo is 7 now, and last weekend I let him hold a chisel for the first time, my hands wrapped around his small ones the way my grandfather's were once wrapped around mine. I think about my grandfather every time I'm out there sanding something that doesn't need it, just because my hands want something honest to do, and I think, some people protect you with their voice, and some people protect you in silence, years in advance, in a metal box behind a false panel, trusting you'll find it when you need it. If you've ever had to stay quiet and watch someone you love get circled by people who only loved what he had, I want to hear your story. Tell me in the comments, and if this story moved you, subscribe. There are more to come.